Hallo zusammen. Ich bin Alexander und ich verstehe Martin Luther. Ich hasse den Investiture-Streit. I want to preface this video by saying I am not a Christian. However, if you were to put a gun to my head and tell me to pick a religion, I'd probably become Orthodox. This video is for education and jokes, and also to vindicate my long suffering in the process of writing this script. For almost every time that I insult or slander or criticize the Catholic Church, I will put up a photo of a beautiful Catholic cathedral to make you feel a little less bad. And for almost every time, so long as I remember to do it, that I sympathize with Protestant adjacent ideas, I will put up one of your dog water 70s office building ass mega churches to remind you that not every church reform is a banger. You know how in school, when we were taught world history, it was always just kind of glossed over. But, you know, at some point during that 1 week you had on the medieval period, your teacher might drop in there that the Pope thought he was infallible. Yeah, so that wasn't always the case. And the way that idea came about is through this little debacle called the Investiture controversy. Despite its name, the Investiture controversy is not really something that, you know, we in our modern day might consider a controversy. It's more a at least 50-year-long forever war that ripped the Holy Roman Empire apart and sent it down the path to the fractured mess that it was when Voltaire made his infamous quote. For those of you who watched my Sigismund video or my Henry the Fowler video, this is a story about yet another emperor who, in spite of the world being against him, never fucking gave up until his dying breath. But this video is called the Pope's Joker arc, so we'll also be following the Pope, who just couldn't take it anymore. But before we get into the actual story, the meat and potatoes of this little mishap, I need to info dump on you guys a bit first. I'm a fantasy author. That's just what I do.
Holy moly.
See, the HRE lasted 1,000 years. That's a hell of a long time. So much so that the HRE often changes its shape over the centuries to the point where it kind of looks unrecognizable by the time it ended to, you know, where it started, or even some of the phases in the middle.
I am going to be Switzerland.
The empire's first incarnation was under the Carolingian dynasty, where France, Germany, Italy, and everything in between was under the direct control of Charlemagne and his successors, at least in theory. The Carolingian method of governance and the whole equal partition of territory among your sons thing, kind of led to an unstable system, one might call it.
No fighting. No fucking fighting. No fighting. No fucking fighting!
This is where the Etonians came in. This is where you should watch my Henry the Fowler video if you want to know about, well, one of those guys. They soothed everyone's egos for a generation. That was Henry. Then started using the church as a way to hedge against all of their other vassals. You see, church lands were not hereditary because, you know, bishops and abbots and whatnot, they were not supposed to have children. So when one of them died, they did not pass it on to a son. That land went back to the monarch in question, and then the monarch would say, you, and pick someone loyal to them to hand over all the lands to, so that way they don't look like they're hoarding power when really they are. Although that's kind of a less than courteous interpretation of what was going on there, because the dukes were not better. All the money, soldiers, and land owned by a bishop would belong to whoever was appointed bishop, and since the Alps posed kind of a barrier to Rome. It was a lot more convenient for the emperor to invest bishops instead of sending a messenger across the mountains, every time a bishop died. And, those guys tended to be pretty old, so it was convenient. Additionally, doctrine at this time said that the emperor and the pope were two sides of the same coin. The Pope was the spiritual sword and the Emperor was the material sword of Christendom. So during this time, the Emperor had immense power over his domain, since the Church was basically his proxy for controlling huge swaths of territory. Henry III was the single emperor with the most power in the entire history of the Holy Roman Empire. When he spoke, the empire listened. A wave of his hand was all it took to resolve a papal conflict that involved deposing like 3 of them and then installing his own guy. Meanwhile, the Pope was just Bishop of Rome. He did start going on about how he was the Bishop of Bishops and that everyone should be under him, to the point where the Patriarch of Constantinople was like, nah, and schismed. So it's not like this rhetoric of infallibility just kind of like popped up out of nowhere, but it wasn't the norm. The reality of being Pope was that your office was appointed by either the emperor, if you were lucky, or if there was no emperor there, which was how it was like 90% of the time, you would get installed by one of the Roman noble families and special interests. And so long as you were obedient to those families, you were fine. But if you weren't, or they just decided they didn't like the look of your face, an accident would happen and you would be replaced by someone who's a little more puppetable or a little more nice in the face. Or 2 someones, because the rival family thinks they should get a turn at the wheel. Or 3 someones. So Simony's back on the table at this point in time that I'm talking about, which is approximately, actually I don't have an exact year, but like the first half of the 11th century. That's what we're talking. Because I don't remember the date at which Henry III died. A little bit before 1066. That's all I know. But yeah, so simony is a huge problem throughout the church in this period of time for obvious reasons. By the way, simony is when you pay money to get a clergy position, first attempted by Simon the Magician, hence the name simony, although he wasn't really looking for a specific clergy position. He just wanted to know like the esoteric secrets of Christ, whatever that means. That's not what he said, but he wanted to know how to do miracles. Yeah. And the disciples said, nah, fuck you, man. Also, Simon has a lot of importance in Gnostic circles because they believe his slave prostitute mistress named Helen, like Helen of Troy, who they thought was an incarnation of Helen of Troy, who they also thought was an incarnation of the knowledge goddess Sophia, who is an incarnation of God's like holy knowledge, and that the world was created by the demiurge, which is the incarnation of evil, and the material world is embroiled inherently in sin, and that in order to escape evil and be saved, you must follow the serpent from the Garden of Eden, who is actually the good guy and is actually God, and that the only way to free yourself is to become part of God by destroying the physical realm and detaching yourself and becoming a god on your own. The Gnostics, not a huge fan of their theology, personally. And for those of you who are going to comment about my lack of esoteric knowledge, which had happened more than once, if you like the Gnostics, I'm sorry to tell you, buddy, that ain't it. Look up Hermeticism. That's slightly better. Anyway, there was this one time where there were 3 popes at the same time, and it happened to coincide with Henry III coming down to Rome. So bad time for the popes. Henry was such a big balls emperor that he just waved his hand and said, fuck y'all, my guy's in charge, beat it. And they listened to him. And that's how Pope Clement II was appointed to the Holy See. Obviously, the emperor walking into Rome and deposing not 1, but 3 different popes before appointing his own was not exactly a great look for the papacy. But as Henry III returned to Germany, his later years were marked by ceaseless wars and paranoia, because you either die the not yet emperor or you live long enough to see yourself become a shit emperor. Seriously, like, no, Henry the Fowler was not a... I'm trying to think of if there are any emperors who managed to become emperor and then didn't, like, spiral during their later years. And I don't think there is one. Maybe Otto? Maybe? Or anyway, Henry made this really bad political decision during a civil war that was going on in Hungary at the time. The cost was mostly put on Bavarian Carinthia, who revolted because they couldn't take it anymore. The Bohemians and Poles, who had offered their vassalage to Henry, saw what was going on in Hungary and were like, I could do that. He then ousted his political opponent, Godfrey the Bearded, who was Duke of Lotharingia, which destabilized that entire region. And his paranoia about his magnates caused him to shun pretty much all of his advisors, except the Pope and his wife, Agnes of Poitou. French is slowly becoming my worst enemy, like, as a language. I thought it was Spanish, but no. Figures it'd be another Latin language. The Saxons, who had been on top of the empire with the Ottonian dynasty, which, the Ottonians hailed from Saxony, so that was why, felt they had been excluded from the royal seat for a little too long, and they wanted to try and assassinate Henry. They even considered assassinating a 7-year-old, that being Henry IV, Henry III's son. There's a lot of Henrys in this video, but I think you're going to be able to figure out who's who. Godfrey, Henry III's fucking arch nemesis, because none of this fighting was necessary at all, married into the inheritance of Tuscany, which was a huge swath of northern Italy. He basically shut the gate to the Alps, meaning people could only cross that path with his say-so. To Henry's credit, he figured that he started some unwinnable conflicts and tried his best to create a compromise with his enemies in his final years, but it was too little too late. Henry III died at only 39 years old, leaving a 6-year-old child on the throne. That's Henry IV. I'm now realizing that, holy shit, the Saxons wanted to assassinate a 7-year-old after... Is that better? Is that better than assassinating a 6-year-old before the emperor's dead? What's better, assassinating a child who hasn't lost a parent or assassinating a child who has lost a parent? So Henry IV is on the throne now. I will be referring to him when I say Henry from now on. Now, this sort of thing in the past hadn't been a huge problem for the empire until now, when a child was left on the throne. Because the times when it did happen before, the imperial court was blessed with some fucking immaculate regents, all right? I'm not kidding around here. Saint Adelheid and Theophanu, who ran the regency for the Ottonians when Otto III was a little baby boy, they killed it, man. Both of them deserve their own video at some point. Agnes wasn't bad per se, but she couldn't meet the high standards that being a regent demanded. For a while, it was kind of okay because they had Pope Victor II on their side, and he was able to cover for them. But once he died, Agnes's weaknesses started showing. The most consequential part of that is she lost control of Carinthia, Bavaria, and Swabia. So all of southern Germany, like all at once. And all of these duchies would fall into the hands of men who would become Henry IV's greatest enemies. So good going there, Agnes. But chief among the dickheads who were trying to make this regency just a bad time for everybody was Archbishop Anno of Cologne. Anno had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and he wanted to get in on this inheritance party and, get some land for himself, because it was fucking open season on Henry III's former territories. In addition to all of this, the Roman aristocrats installed their own pope, again, without consulting anyone else, which pissed off the Imperial court quite a bit. But back on Cologne, he and a few other magnates, including Otto von Nordheim, would decide for themselves that Agnes and her regency was not the right path for the empire after a massive failure in Hungary that ruined the empire's reputation. They formed a new imperial government, but in order to assert their influence, Anno had to kidnap the 12-year-old Henry IV by trapping him on a boat. Henry jumped overboard after he realized he was being abducted, but before he realized he can't swim. So, not his fault. He was being kidnapped. He could have drowned if not for one Count Egbert, but he didn't. So, depending on your opinion of Henry IV, that is either a great thing or you want to go back in time and assassinate Count Egbert the way you would a baby Hitler. This forced Agnes to give control of the empire to Anno, but the imperial reputation was already broken. There was a church reform movement that had also been growing at the same time, and that church reform movement decided that the emperor was not the person to look to for ensuring their clerics were right by God, so they turned to the Pope instead. This whole event of Anno taking over the regency is noted as being a very traumatic event for Henry in some of the chronicles. He fucking hated Anno for the rest of time and felt as though he couldn't trust any of his magnates. This would prove to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But he hated Anno so much that the fucking second he comes of age and is granted a sword at the ceremony marking your coming of age, he immediately draws it on the archbishop and was only stopped by his mother's intervention. When Henry came into his majority, he tried to get some of the territories his mother lost back under his control and consolidate what little he had left. Most of the royal domain was in Saxony around the Harz Mountains because that's where Goslar is. Goslar is a really cool palace. If you ever go to Germany, go to Goslar. But it was up there because they inherited that land from the Saxon-Etonians. The problem being is that the Saxons are like the imperial equivalent of like the mean girls at the imperial court, right? So when Henry starts building a bunch of new castles and infrastructure and mans them with ministeriales, who are unfree serf soldiers from Swabia, and they ignore all the Saxon customs and rights because they have their own little like secret club stuff, they get pissed off. And by the way, this is a time where being a Saxon as opposed to a Swabian or Franconian or Bavarian was a much bigger deal. There isn't really a sense of like what a German is. That's not really like, it's kind of a thing, but it's like back in the day with the US where like you were an Ohioan first, American second, to the point where they saw the other types of Germans as foreigners. But what tipped everything over the edge was Otto von Nordheim being accused of plotting against Henry's life, which, considering the fact that he was involved in the kidnapping when he was 12, that isn't like a hugely far-fetched assumption. But we don't really know if Henry was just like making shit up. Some chroniclers claim that Henry paid someone to make those accusations, but chroniclers also say Henry was a serial rapist, the spawn of the devil, and a whole bunch of other slanders, so, take that how you will. Regardless, Otto didn't show up to defend himself in court and was branded an outlaw because of that. Otto was an incredibly powerful magnate in Saxony, so he was able to, start a rebellion. It was pretty fucking brutal, but Henry, after a decade of watching humiliation after humiliation befall his family, was able to have this one win in defeating the revolt and asserting his authority over Saxony. But a year and a half after this, things go terribly, terribly wrong. I don't know how this is going to look after editing, but I have so far recorded 26 minutes and I haven't even hit part 2 yet. But I thought this was going to suck to edit. So on the other side of the Alps, the papacy had been enjoying an almost passive buff to their reputation because of the empire's like slow downward turn into incompetence. As Agnes's regency was flailing and Henry didn't manage to fix much aside from the one win with the Saxon Rebellion, people had begun losing faith in the imperial administration. See, all this shit was happening smack dab in the middle of the medieval warm period, where harvests, it's the opposite of the mini ice age in the 1600s, all right? Harvests are better. There's more food. People stopped worrying about starving to death so much. You know, they still do it a little bit as a treat, but not so much. And, you know, when people have food security, they start thinking about things other than food security. You know, in our time, we've kind of hit it to where, like, now we don't know what to do with ourselves. And we do modern art and hedonism. But, you know, back in the day, when people ran out of stuff to do, they turned to God. Problem with that, they were a little too invested in their spiritual health, at least for the status quo at the time. I think it's a perfectly reasonable demand to not want corruption in the church. But simony was a huge problem. That was like the main form of corruption that bishops were having. That and like it was kind of unclear at that time as to whether the clergy were allowed to have families or not. So a lot of them did. And so it was kind of like, it wasn't a huge deal back then because they didn't like stamp their foot and say like specifically no families. But, you know, it was still a questionable practice. But the simony is the important part. So actually, honestly, the church corruption then is not that bad compared to like the Western Schism or how bad it's gonna get throughout the course of this video. But, you know, people were still worried about this because it called into question the validity of the sacraments that were being given out by Simoniac priests. If a Simoniac baptized you, were you really baptized? Were you really married? Had you ever really taken communion? Valid concerns in a society as religious as medieval Europe. Plus, corruption of that nature just is not a great look for any church at any time. So at first, people looked to the emperor to fix things because he was supposed to be like the counterbalance to the clergy, right? After all, the Council of Sutri had proven that and shown to the world that, you know, the emperor wore the pants in this relationship until those pants fell down and the empire tripped and fell on its face in Hungary. So it kind of became clear by the time Henry took power that the church itself would have to initiate this reform. One of the staunchest supporters of the reform movement by the church was Godfrey the Bearded, who would probably rather die than let the Salian dynasty get an ounce of credit for any kind of reform. Speaking of which, when Godfrey died, he passed his huge inheritance to his stepdaughter, Matilda of Tuscany. She's more than just a pretty face, CK3 fans. Matilda was an even more extreme supporter of the church doing the reform than her stepfather. In fact, it was more accurate to say that she was the church's vassal more than she was the emperor's. Rome could call on her for literally anything, and she'd be there, ready and willing. Now, the face of the papal reform movement is a cardinal named Hildebrand, who had been born a blacksmith's son but had risen up the ranks to become one of the most powerful church officials. And with that power, he managed to successfully prevent one of the noble families from putting, their own guy on the throne of St. Peter, and with the help of, Godfrey's soldiers, because the papacy didn't have soldiers at the time, but Hildebrand wants to change that. Hildebrand was also the man who formed the first ever papal army, funny enough. When Pope Alexander II had to deal with an anti-pope whose cardinals decided the emperor didn't get to pick popes either, and considered Empress Agnes's decision to... Okay, I wrote this down and I still can't understand it. So I think Pope Alexander II had to deal with an anti-pope when the cardinals decided that, well, okay, here. Alexander II was appointed by Empress Agnes, is what I'm assuming is missing out here. And I don't know why I was confused. Okay, well, I know why I was confused. This is church politics, and that's always confusing. But Alexander II, Pope appointed by the Emperor. Cardinals say Emperor doesn't get to decide who the Pope is, so they elect an anti-Pope. And then Hildebrand forms papal army to kill the anti-Pope. Some say that Hildebrand himself led these armies to war, sword in hand, which is a big no-no for clerics under canon law. But, you know, warrior bishops are cool, so I think it should get a pass. This guy, Hildebrand, managed to make the Roman aristocracy get their hands off the papacy while denying the emperor the ability to appoint a pope, and set a precedent for fielding papal armies. So in other words, the Pope has hands now. Not to mention that they now lead the church reform movement. The emperor isn't even in the fucking picture anymore. To capitalize on all this, the papacy began spreading its influence all over Europe. In the past, the papacy's diplomatic reach basically ended at France, the Empire, and Italy, and occasionally they would send a letter to, like, somewhere as far off as Hungary or England. But as the papacy was gaining power, they started collecting oaths of fealty from monarchs all over Europe like they were fucking Pokemon. The most impactful among them was the Norman king of Sicily at the time, who basically became the Pope's extra muscle. By the time Pope Alexander II died, Hildebrand had done so much to empower the papacy, which the Pope had never previously enjoyed, that the people of Rome voted Hildebrand into the Holy See by acclamation, where so many people in Rome want you to be Pope that the cardinals just say, yeah, no, if we told them no, they would come in and massacre us. So yeah, you're Pope now. And that's how Pope Gregory VII rose to power. And he started sowing the seeds against Emperor Henry IV. He sent a letter to the King of Hungary saying that if he received his lands as a fiefdom from the emperor, which Hungary and Poland had both done, the king would be no more than a local ruler equivalent to a count or a duke. And them's fighting words, but he said to be truly king, the King of Hungary needed to offer his fealty to the Pope. This was all according to Gregory, by the way. Source, trust me. That was Gregory's source, not my source. There are chronicles about this. Gregory was the one making shit up here. He said that the emperor, who had been considered an equal to the Pope, or even the Pope's superior at the time, was no greater station than any other temporal ruler, and that the emperor owes obedience to the Pope. This started a very long series of Gregory VII just kind of making shit up about the Pope's position. Sometimes he finds theological backing for his arguments, but they're almost always a post hoc thing. So he'll just say shit and then go look in the Bible to make sure he can actually back that up. And most of these things can be found in Gregory's manifesto. Yes, the Pope who went on a villain arc to reform the papacy has a fucking manifesto. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yes. Oh, $15 from Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski in the house. Wow. That's the unicorn. Oh, man. Yeah, wait a minute.
The Dictatus Pop... Guys, I don't know Latin. Latin languages have never agreed with me. Dictatus Papae. That's my best shot. The Dictatus Papae was a list of 27 statements of fact, according to Gregory, regarding the role of the papacy, including bangers like that he alone may use the imperial insignia, that of the Pope alone all princes shall kiss the feet, that it may be permitted to him to depose emperors, that he may be permitted to transfer bishops if need be, that he himself may be judged by no one, that the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, the scripture bearing witness that he may depose and reinstate bishops without assembling a synod, that he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. These 8 of the 27 exist particularly to shit all over the imperial authority. Being able to absolve men of their oaths of fealty and being able to depose emperors are obvious, but the ability to depose bishops also directly attacks one of the main levers of power that the emperor wields. This is not an accident. Gregory wants the fucking smoke. Either that or he was just that crazy with the whole the Roman Church has never and will never err shit. That's where we get the idea of trying to enforce the papal infallibility thing. Instead of it just being a like background theological thing that it was treated as up until that point. Like it was in scripture, but nobody enforced it because it's kind of an insane thing to say. Just my opinion. Look up Innocent the Third. I think he's the guy that killed a bunch of people. And from there, Gregory just keeps schmoving. He sends letters to pretty much like every fucking bishop in Christendom with new rules and regulations regarding clerical celibacy, simony, and that if you're suspected of having done anything that violates the new rules, you get deposed. So Gregory just slash and burns the clergy, deposing bishops and excommunicating anyone who resists. England, Poland, Hungary, and Denmark are too weak and too distant to resist. France decides to bend the knee. And the only form of resistance to Gregory's fanaticism is Henry IV and the Empire. And Henry is pissed. Being left out of a papal election, that happens sometimes, you know? Rome likes to make trouble sometimes. That's relatively normal. But a pope going around deposing German bishops and excommunicating the ones who don't obey? That is a direct attack on the only real power the imperial government has over its vassals at this point. The ban on investiture of bishops by lay people in particular would ruin him. See, 2/3 of the imperial armies came from imperial prince bishops. If Henry couldn't install loyal people as bishops, that's 66% of his military might just gone, reduced to dust. And out of all of Gregory's demands, that one was among the least theologically sound. So Henry wasn't gonna fucking put up with it. Thus begins the investiture controversy.
You know, maybe I even stand up and hit a little boogie with it. Oh, what's that, the SpongeBob? Huh? Oh.
This whole shit show starts with the investiture of the Bishop of Milan. See, Milan is almost always a massive thorn in the side for the emperor, and for nearly 3 generations, Milan had been embroiled in a civil war over church reform. The Patria Party, which fought on behalf of the church, lost its leader, meaning the Imperial Party could take over, allowing Henry to invest the new archbishop. By the way, I say church and imperial parties. These are not the Guelphs and Ghibellines. That's later, because the Weiblingans aren't important yet. Gregory crashes out over this and sends a letter admonishing Henry and threatening to excommunicate the emperor, because, as one does. I know the meme is that like every emperor got excommunicated, but I'm pretty sure this would be like the first time it has actually been considered in history. It might have happened before during the Carolingian dynasty, but I don't think it happened during the Ottonians. So this would be like the first time. But see, the emperor is still under the impression that the two offices are equal, and as far as he's concerned, Gregory's just making shit up. So he refuses to bend the knee. There is one positive regarding Gregory's radical approach. The bishops who had been deposed north of the Alps were just as pissed as the emperor was. So Henry calls a synod of all these bishops, and in spite of it being winter, 26 of them decide to make a show to figure out their next steps against Pope Gregory. And among them is Hugo the White, a cardinal from Italy who's fallen out with Gregory. He makes the claim that Gregory's fucking lost it. It claimed Gregory, a 60-year-old man, was living in sin, if you know what I mean, with Matilda of Tuscany, who was 20 at the time. This isn't like an unfounded accusation. Matilda and Gregory were unusually close. I'm not saying it happened, but I'm not saying it didn't happen either. And yet, this pope harasses the bishops of Germany from a high horse while being unable to live up to his own standards. And that was what pissed off the other bishops the most. So the bishops and Henry composed a letter to Gregory. This is a translation from the History of the Germans podcast because I don't read Middle High German. Henry, king not by force, but by the grace of God, to Hildebrand, at present not pope, but false monk. You deserve such a greeting for the disorder you created. There is no rank in the church which you have not made to partake in shame instead of honor, in curse instead of blessing. For, to mention only a few most important instances out of so many, you have dared to lay hands on the leaders of the Holy Church, the Lord's anointed, the archbishops, the bishops and priests. You have them trampled underfoot like slaves who do not know what their master is doing. By crushing them, have you endeared yourself to the commonest of people. You have regarded them all as ignorant, but yourself as omniscient. This knowledge, however, you have used not for your edification, but for destruction. So that we are justified in believing that Saint Gregory, whose name you have arrogated to yourself, prophesied about you when he said, the pride of him who has power becomes the greater the number of those who are subject to him, and he thinks that he himself can do more than all. And indeed, we have endured this, being anxious to preserve the honor of the Apostolic See, but you have understood our humility as fear, and therefore have not been afraid to rise up against the royal power given to us by God, daring to threaten to take it from us, as if we received our kingdoms from you, as if the kingdom and the dominion were in your hands and not in God's. And this, although our Lord Jesus Christ has called us to kingship, but has not called you to the priesthood. For you have ascended by the following steps. For by cunning, which the monastic profession abhors, have you obtained money. By money, favor. By the sword, the throne of peace. And from the throne of peace, you have disturbed the peace by arming the subjects against those who would rule over them, by teaching that our bishops, called by God, are to be despised, by taking offices from priests and giving it to laymen, by permitting them to depose or condemn those who had been ordained as teachers by the laying on of the bishop's hands. And you even laid hand on me, who, though unworthy to be among the anointed, yet have been anointed to the kingdom. On me, who, as the tradition of the Holy Fathers teaches, may not be deposed for any crime unless, God forbid, I have departed from the faith. On me, who is the subject to the judgment of God alone. The wisdom of the Holy Fathers even left Julian the Apostate not to be tried by themselves, but left it to God alone to judge and depose him. For even the true Pope Peter exclaims, "Fear God, honor the king." But you, who do not fear God, dishonor him in me, whom he has appointed. Therefore St. Paul, when he spared no angel of heaven, if he had preached otherwise, did not exempt you, who teach otherwise on earth. For he says, if anyone, neither I nor an angel from heaven, preaches any other gospel than that which has preached to you, he will be condemned. You then, condemned by this curse, and by the judgment of all our bishops, and by our own, descend and renounce the apostolic chair which you have usurped. Let another ascend to the throne of St. Peter, who shall not exercise violence under the guise of religion, but shall teach the sound doctrine of St. Peter. I, Henry, king by the grace of God, say to you, together with all our bishops, descend. Descend or be damned forever. And there ain't no going back from that. Before Gregory, the church has always operated on the words of the Bible. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So when Gregory, after receiving this hell of a letter, excommunicates Henry and relieved all bonds of fealty to any of his vassals. It was a huge deal. Even though kings had been excommunicated with some amount of regularity since 390 AD. With all the German bishops against Gregory, you'd think Henry would have the power to march an army down to Rome and deal with this once and for all. But when the excommunication comes in, Henry found that all his bishops had changed their minds. There were a lot of reasons for this, but among them is the fact that the synod Henry had called made some less than strong arguments against Gregory, basically claiming that he was not pope because of the way he'd been elected. The idea of cardinals electing the pope and no one else was a very new concept at the time. And even though he'd been elected in a strange way, Gregory had been properly ordained, a situation that many of the German bishops found themselves in. So taking an army to Gregory for that reason could easily backfire on them. Additionally, Henry wasn't all that great at picking bishops who were respected by their congregations. If Gregory decided to depose most of them, there was really no way to stop him. The congregation would not retain their loyalty, and they would not be able to remain in power in spite of the Pope's deposition. That'd just be it for them. Also, Henry had no anti-pope at the time to replace Gregory, which he probably should have picked. That one was easy, man. But the most damning of all was the fact that when Henry finished his business with the Saxon rebellion, he had the opportunity to show mercy. He did not take it. So a lot of nobles were more interested in building up their own autonomy separate from the empire, just in case they happened to offend him with something, and he decided that he wasn't feeling in a very reconciliation-y mood. This forced Henry to back down, especially when the dukes of the southern territories that Agnes had lost during her regency sided with the Pope, and many other magnates took the Pope's word seriously and wanted to elect a new king, since spiritually that was less risky than deposing a Pope. But most were afraid of causing any other destabilizing shifts in the empire structure, so Henry's magnates demanded that he write a letter to Gregory saying that he would obey the Pope and step down from his duties. But the magnates would only elect a new king if Henry couldn't relieve the papal ban within a year. They invited Gregory to Augsburg at the end of the year to decide what to do and decide if Henry could remain king. Effectively, Henry was now an excommunicated private citizen. The only person who could restore his position was Gregory himself, so Henry had to get to him before the Pope could get to Augsburg. He and his wife set off for Italy after Christmas, their clock ending somewhere in February. None of his magnates or bishops would travel with him, and only his closest supporters would provide any kind of assistance. With Swabia, Bavaria, and Carinthia all in the hands of his enemies, Henry had to travel around Burgundy and travel through Mont-Cenis. I hate French. The one pass that wasn't owned by any of the German dukes, it was under the control of his wife Bertha's family. Had Henry never married Bertha, he never would have made it to Italy. And that almost didn't happen since Henry made an appeal to annul his engagement before they were married, since they had grown up together more like siblings than anything else, so their relationship was just kind of like weird. Thankfully, Henry's good intentions as an adolescent didn't ruin him and they were forced to marry anyway, and it turns out the relationship was pretty good after that. I also feel the need to mention that the winter of 1077 caused the River Rhine to freeze over, meaning all the Alpine passes were under similar conditions, and cold as shit. However, once Henry got to the other side of the Alps, the bishops of Italy flocked to his banner, because they too were kind of pissed off with Gregory, and hoped Henry would take command of their armies to depose him. So for a second there, Henry is in command of a pretty serious military force. Meanwhile, Gregory is making his way to Augsburg, and upon hearing that Henry now has an army, Matilda shelters Gregory in Canossa, her strongest fortification. And Canossa is not one castle. It is a castle on a hill where all the entrances to that hill are protected by 6 or 7 other castles. So we arrive at a stalemate. The Imperial army can't overcome Canossa, and the Pope can't travel to Augsburg. Henry's only course of action is to get a team to intercede with the Pope on his behalf and try to plead his case. He goes to Hugh of Cluny, a hugely significant figure in church reform, and Henry's godfather, and Matilda of Tuscany, who's still technically an imperial vassal. This image that I'm gonna put up of Henry begging on his knees to the both of them to plead his case is, as far as I know, the only medieval image of a king on his knees before a woman for political reasons rather than sexual ones. Negotiations are tense and slow going. Henry's main goal is to get the papal ban released before Augsburg, so he at least has a chance to keep his crown. But Gregory doesn't budge until Hugh and Matilda manage to appeal to Gregory's mercy. Gregory finally gives Henry the chance to repent and be received into the papal grace. Images of kings kneeling to beg or repent are never spontaneous. It acts as a sort of safe word in medieval politics to just stop all the weird shit, all right? Just let's go back to normal again. And the ceremony of Henry's repentance to Gregory was a very detailed process of humiliation in exchange for readmittance. This event is known as the Road to Canossa, or the Humiliation of Canossa, and I'm told is a pretty huge deal in, like, the history education over in Europe. See, Henry was ordered to walk from his camp, situated 2 castles away, because castle plus ring of castles, to Canossa in bare feet and a hair shirt, which was the traditional garb of monks at the time and was very itchy. But upon approaching the gates of Canossa, he was refused entry and forced to wait outside for 3 whole days, fasting, before being let in, only to kneel before Gregory and beg forgiveness. Gregory agrees to lift the excommunication, but he refuses to restore his right to rule the empire. This was an exceptionally cruel display by Gregory, but Henry had no choice but to accept. Canossa has historically been a huge scar on the German identity as the ultimate humiliation, at least, until the World Wars and all the complicated modern stuff. Bismarck, when making the statement that Germany would stand for itself and not be beholden to the Catholic Church's influence, said, "We will not go to Canossa." But at the end of it all, Henry was allowed to act again and had to quickly pack up and get to work. Because it turns out, a lot of German magnates don't really give a rat's ass if Henry isn't excommunicated anymore. In a classic pro-gamer move, Henry basically immediately defies Gregory by establishing himself as monarch over Italy again. A Reichstag is organized to decide on how to solve all this shit. They invite the Pope and King Henry in March. Gregory, who had not been willing to leave Canossa and go 50 miles to a synod in Mantua, much less Reichstag in Germany, sent Lagates instead. Henry had wanted to go, but was still being blocked by his southern dukes, and if he went through Monsigny the way he had come, he would never get there in time to plead his case. So he instead gathered forces in Italy and ousted the Duke of Carinthia by installing someone else who was more loyal to his cause. But Henry still only manages to get there in April. In March, his magnates elected the Duke of Swabia, Rudolf von Rheinfeld, as anti-king, sparking the Great Saxon Revolt. Because there was 2 of them. And more, because the Saxons love to revolt. So do the Bavarians. But Gregory didn't endorse Rudolf, in spite of Henry making it clear he wasn't going to obey as he promised the Pope. Gregory kind of fucked himself over with the Pope never heirs thing, because now he could never admit that Henry IV, in spite of having suffered a great humiliation, still managed to kind of play Gregory for a fool. It's also speculated that Gregory wanted to be the one to pick the emperor, so that might have held him back, because he's a petty bastard. Once he did endorse Rudolf, it necessitated that he excommunicate Henry again, but the climate was so polarized it didn't even matter. Those who were with Henry were with him, and those who were against him were against him. Rudolf is pretty sure he has the upper hand at first, but Henry deposes him as Duke of Swabia, replacing him with one of his followers, Frederick. Frederick owns a lot of land in the middle of Swabia, and so is able to oust Rudolf pretty, well, not easily, but he's able to oust him. Frederick also ends up building a castle near the village of Stauf, which would later be known as Castle Hohenstaufen, as in the Hohenstaufen dynasty. As in Barbarossa. In Bavaria, Henry managed to push out his enemies himself and took control over the duchy directly. And like that, the south is Henry's again. Rudolph's power base shifts to Saxony, hence the name of the Great Saxon Revolt. Henry managed to get the Swabians, Bavarians, Carinthians, and Lotharingians, and Bohemians on his side, meaning he had far more resources. But Rudolph had Otto von Nordheim on his side, who was one of the greatest generals of his age. As such, the two sides found themselves in a Mexican standoff of sorts. But eventually, in a battle that Henry actually lost, Rudolph would get mortally wounded. With victory in Germany, Henry turns his forces south to go beat a woman, specifically Matilda, so he can oust Gregory and install his new anti-pope, Clement III. The pro-imperial bishops in northern Italy actually took care of that task for him by raising their own troops and defeating Matilda. With the way clear, Henry marched his army down to Rome unopposed and besieged it. He managed to take over everything except for Castel Sant'Angelo and enthroned his new anti-pope before being crowned emperor by said anti-pope in 1084. And for just a split second, we were so back. Only for it to be so over 2 months later. Gregory called on Norman Sicily. Remember those guys? They were part of the narrative before. And, being Normans, they managed to fuck up the Imperial army, forcing them to flee Rome. Rome was then plundered in the process, leading the citizens to rise up and force Gregory himself to flee, so, no one gets to have Rome. Gregory would later die in exile. The cardinals would then elect Victor III to the papal throne, although Clement III still occupied St. Peter's. Meanwhile, Henry took advantage of his rival's death to consolidate his power as much as possible, and to negotiate with some of his opponents. Victor didn't last long as a pope, so the cardinals would vote for Urban II, aka the guy who called the first ever crusade. Unfortunately, the Crusades are not really relevant to this storyline. Also, there's so much Crusade content. Honestly, I don't think I'd have anything to say that isn't everywhere already. But Urban II does negotiate a marriage between the 43-year-old Matilda of Tuscany and the 18-year-old Welf V, son of Henry's Saxon opponent Welf I, leading to another invasion into Matilda's territories by Henry. For 5 years, it's all stalemates and skirmishes and negotiations, and this fucking video is already long enough. Holy shit, my eye is twitching. Oh, I don't like that. Oh, that's weird. Stop it. So, nothing else really important happens until 1093, when Matilda and her husband managed to turn Henry's son Conrad against him. Conrad rebelled against his father and escaped to Milan. There is a story that claims Henry tried to kill himself after this, but it comes from a very biased account, so grain of salt. But regardless of how, it's agreed upon that Henry had a big he was not having a good time. Conrad would eventually meet with Pope Urban II in Cremona, and with the plan to be crowned as anti-emperor, I guess. I don't know if it's appropriate to blame Conrad for the event that comes next, because both Henry V and Lothar III do this when they don't have to and end up making it into a sort of tradition. But Conrad is the first imperial royal I think we have on record performing the office of the groom ceremony since the Carolingian dynasty. It's this thing where the emperor hopeful gets off his horse and leads the pope's horse into the city. And it doesn't sound like much, but it's a symbol of submission to papal authority and hadn't been done since the Carolingians. In performing this act, Conrad accepts the Dictatus Papae, Gregory's manifesto, and becomes a loyal vassal of the Pope. This more or less destroys everything that Henry had spent his life fighting for. So, fuck you, Conrad. If that wasn't enough, Henry's wife, Bertha, who had been his most loyal advisor, who had followed him all the fucking way to Canossa, died a few years earlier. He remarried a Russian princess named Eupraxia, and it seemed that the marriage wasn't quite as successful as his relationship with Bertha was. Insert Russian mail-order bride joke here. But Eupraxia sent a message to Matilda of Tuscany pleading for help, and the Duchess obliged, extracting her from the royal court in Verona. And then Eupraxia immediately starts accusing Henry of all these horrific acts that she suffered, like Henry's men gang raping her, which we have zero evidence for. But she repeats all these really sickening allegations to a papal synod, likely starting a lot of the wild accusations found in the more propaganda-oriented chronicles of Henry's life. Whether or not they're true, probably not. Henry had been betrayed by both his wife and son. He's trapped in Italy because, once again, his enemies control all the Alpine passes. I'm guessing he lost a few battles there. And now he's completely outnumbered by all his Italian enemies. Henry's only saving grace is another marriage going down the shitter, that of Welf and Matilda. Matilda does not give one shit about Welf's political advice, and wants to give all her lands to the Pope instead of, her husband. Which is why I'm kind of more inclined to believe that they might have had a little something going on there. So when Welf's father, Welf IV, finds out that his family's going to get jack shit, he reopens negotiations with Henry. And after 7 years, Henry's finally allowed to return to Germany with the help of Berthold von Zeringen, one of his former worst enemies. But everyone just wants to bring this nonsense to an end, and frankly, so do I. Henry's price to leave was very simple. He had to give Bavaria back to Welf and make it a hereditary duchy so no king could appoint the duke again. He also had to give Zeringen a ducal title. Since the Hohenstaufen already had Swabia, Henry gave him a ducal title out of his lands that were in what is now Switzerland. Upon this reconciliation, all the German princes recognized Henry as emperor and allowed him to reign as a first among equals style of emperor, which is better than, not being emperor, but it came without the authority wielded by his father and grandfather. His only real power left was that he was still investing bishops. However, Henry had to think about succession, since his treacherous son Conrad had run out of usefulness once the alliance between Welf and Matilda fell out. He had just kind of been given a modest castle in Italy and sent to rot. Although he was technically still king of the Romans, he was deposed pretty much without issue. Henry pushed through the election of his second son, Henry V, and you might have noticed that in this whole investiture controversy thing, not a ton of it has been about actual investiture. I mean, this is not rock bottom for Henry, but he's certainly not at his most powerful. The papacy thinks this is a good time to push that issue. We know the reason why Henry cannot allow the Pope to take over investiture of bishops, and we know why the Pope wants to do that, because that's kind of in canon law, but also gives them a shit ton more power. So Henry writes to the Pope one last time, who is Paschalis II now, seeking some kind of compromise or reconciliation. Paschalis sends back an excommunication. I'm sorry, Catholics. I know I dog on your sect a lot with the whole 30 Years' War video and everything, and with all the shit that Gregory has pulled throughout this video. I hate Protestant architecture, and frankly, I find a lot of Protestant services kind of insufferable. I don't think me buying a coffee at Starbucks has anything to do with Jesus, guys. Oh, holy shit, dude. I get Martin Luther now. The investiture controversy is what radicalized me. This is just... it's so petty at this point. Thankfully, after having been through the ringer for 30 years at this point, Henry figured out basic PR and made a whole song and dance about going on pilgrimage to atone for his sins and his ongoing efforts to protect the ecclesiastical princes of Germany from the land-hungry secular lords, and all of his contributions to building the Cathedral of Speyer, which is a pretty damn cool cathedral and is also where all three Henrys are buried. All three Salian Henrys. The other two Henrys are somewhere in Sachsen-Anhalt. This managed to get Germany on his side this time around, so no one took the whole released from your oaths thing seriously, since no one wanted yet another civil war. Although that wouldn't remain the sentiment for very long. In winter of 1103, Henry invited everyone down to Regensburg, the capital of Bavaria at the time, for Christmas and whatnot. One Count Sieghard of Burghausen showed up with a few too many soldiers, claiming he needed extra protection because the court was too friendly to the Saxons. Yeah, Henry IV's court, real friendly to the Saxons. Love them. They'd never have a reason to revolt. Though apparently Sieghard was kind of right, because he died. Not because of the Saxons. Sieghard had antagonized the Ministerialis, the unfree soldiers that made up the bulk of the armed forces under the emperor's direct command. And the Ministerialis had a bit of a chip on their shoulder for not being actual knights. So they broke into Sieghard's lodgings and smoked him like a beef brisket. The public blamed Henry for the murders, since Sieghard was a guest and therefore under Henry's protection. Henry was also a huge sponsor of the Ministerialis because, they were loyal. So feuds break out across the empire and it's civil war again. It seems we're really repeating history here, because while Henry is mustering his army in Fritzlar, his son and heir, Henry V, defects to the opposition again. And he sends a letter to the Pope asking for his support. And the Pope absolved him of all obligations to his father, allowing him to basically do whatever he wanted. These fucking dumbass kids, I swear to God. Henry and Henry spent 1105 fighting each other, and while the younger Henry failed to successfully challenge his father in open conflict, he was gaining control over southern Germany through politics, even flipping the Hohenstaufens, since Henry IV's great ally, Duke Frederick, had died the year before, and now there was a kid on the throne. Elder Henry tried to assault Regensburg, only to be betrayed by his allies after only 3 days of siege. He fled north and was caught near Koblenz by Henry V. Henry V demanded his father's reconciliation with the Pope and swore to guarantee his father's safety as they traveled to Mainz, so Henry IV could state his case. But if you remember, all the oaths to Henry IV are null and void. So on the fourth day of traveling to Mainz, Henry V imprisons his father at Birkelheim. Birkelheim, yeah, sehr good. And essentially forces Henry IV to abdicate the throne by bringing him to a council full of Henry V's supporters and letting his father's supporters just stand around in Mainz waiting for a council that never happens. One final fuck you to Henry IV. Henry IV knows that even though he's abdicated, his son wouldn't be able to let him live long, so he flees to Cologne and then to Liège. And somehow, through all this, Henry still hasn't given up on himself. His remaining allies pulled together in Cologne and defeated his son's armies. But just when things looked like they might turn around again, Henry IV dies. Of illness.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Henry V took power in Germany and immediately turned on the Pope, since Paschalis II, in his infinite wisdom, began acting like a nagging old turd, scolding Henry for investing bishops, in spite of the fact that Paschalis was in an incredibly weak position. So Henry crossed the Alps and beat the Pope into submission. Very Nietzschean. The resulting agreement was the Concordat of 1111, where Henry gave the church its autonomy back in exchange for the lands of the German clergy that had been donated to them for safekeeping. Henry wouldn't interfere with any ecclesiastical affairs, and Paschalis would crown him emperor. However, when the concession of lands were read out, the bishops and abbots rioted because they did not want to give back any of that land because they are pious clergymen. Henry took the Pope and his cardinals hostage in response and demanded the right of investiture instead. When they caved, Henry emerged as emperor and maintained the right to investiture. One might call this a win for the emperors, and it kind of was. Except for the fact that the agreement was so obviously made under duress that the Pope immediately breaks the agreement once Henry is gone. Let's hit it for round 3. Henry rebels and gets excommunicated. He appoints an anti-pope. All of Henry's opponents secede from the empire, and it's another 10 years of civil war. Henry V's power eventually wanes to the point where he has no choice but to negotiate again, leading to the Concordat of Worms, which forces Henry to give up the right to investiture and the right to appoint popes. Full stop. Thus, the conflict between Pope and Emperor results in a total victory for the Pope. Well, at least for round 1. Oh yeah, did I mention? This is round 1 of 3. Because Henry dies with no heirs, and then there's another civil war. And once that's over, the Empire has a new guy in the ring. You might have heard of him. A certain Frederick Barbarossa. I'm so fucking done with this video. Oh, I don't know how long this video is, but fuck, did I even tell people to subscribe? I don't remember. Subscribe and join my emailing list. Please. Oh, I need food. Okay, bye.